The night I served dinner to my in-laws, the entire table burst into laughter, not because the food was bad, but because I made it. They didn't even taste it before mocking me. I can still hear Margaret's voice echoing in my head, sharp and cold. "You call this cooking? My son deserves better." I remember how my hands trembled as I set down each plate, pretending their laughter didn't slice through me like glass. Ryan didn't say a word, he just lowered his eyes, pretending not to notice his wife being humiliated in front of everyone. I smiled that night. A quiet, broken smile. Because when you're married into a family that worships reputation over respect, silence becomes your only armor. But deep down, something in me cracked. Their laughter didn't just humiliate me, it woke up a truth they had buried for years. They thought they were mocking a naive wife. They had no idea, they were laughing at their own stolen legacy. When I first married into the Moore family, I told myself I was lucky. They were wealthy, respected, known for their elegant manners and spotless reputation. Everyone in town called them the perfect family. And for a while, I wanted to believe it too. Margaret Moore, my mother-in-law, welcomed me with a smile that never reached her eyes. She spoke softly, but every word carried weight. "Elena, in this family, we value presentation above all else," she said as she adjusted the silver cutlery on the dining table. "How things look matters more than how they feel." It sounded harmless then. But I didn't realize it was a warning. Ryan, my husband, tried to bridge the gap between me and his mother. He would say, "Just give her time, Elena. She'll come around." But time only made things colder. The more I tried to please her, the more I felt invisible. Every Sunday, the family gathered for lunch. Philip, my father-in-law, sat at the head of the table, quiet, polite, and completely controlled by his wife's gaze. Clara, my sister-in-law, always found a way to remind me I wasn't born into refinement. Once, when I complimented her dress, she smirked, "Oh, this? It's from Paris. But don't worry, you'll learn what real taste is someday." I laughed it off. I always laughed it off. Because I didn't want to be seen as the emotional, insecure wife. But inside, every comment chipped away at something sacred, my dignity. Aunt Lillian was the only one who seemed to see me for who I was. She'd whisper, "Don't let their pride define your worth, dear." Sometimes, I'd catch her looking at Margaret with a strange expression, half guilt, half fear, as if she knew something the rest of us didn't. I tried everything to belong. I learned their table etiquette, how to fold napkins the Moore way, even how to cook dishes I thought they'd love. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. If I spoke too little, I was cold. If I spoke too much, I was trying too hard. And Ryan, he changed too. He began correcting me in front of them, small things, but they stung. "Elena, that's not how we serve the salad," he'd whisper sharply, as if my mistakes embarrassed him more than they hurt me. I started to notice how their smiles were rehearsed. How their conversations sounded like performances for an audience that wasn't even there. The Moore family didn't live for happiness, they lived for approval. One evening, as I was clearing the table, I overheard Margaret say to Clara, "She'll never be one of us. But let her keep trying, it's amusing." I froze, holding the silver tray so tightly my fingers went numb. That was the first time I realized something was deeply wrong. This family didn't want me to fit in. They wanted me to fail, beautifully. The cracks in the Moore family's perfect image began to show at the dinner table. It was subtle at first, a comment here, a look there, but humiliation has a way of growing roots. It started one afternoon when Margaret announced the family would host a grand charity dinner. It was their biggest annual event, an evening where reputation was everything. She loved reminding us that philanthropy is our legacy. The house buzzed with preparations, menus, and floral themes. I offered to help, hoping this could finally be my chance to prove I belonged. Margaret smiled that tight, polite smile again. "Of course, dear," she said sweetly. "You can cook." The room fell silent. Clara snickered. "Perfect. Let's give them a taste of simplicity." I didn't fully understand her tone until later, when I realized they weren't giving me an opportunity, they were setting a trap. Over the next few days, I planned the menu carefully: homemade bread, rosemary chicken, roasted vegetables, and my mother's special sauce recipe, a dish that once brought comfort to everyone who tasted it. I wanted to make something real, something that came from love, not luxury. When I shared the plan, Margaret waved her hand dismissively. That's far too ordinary, Elena. Our guests expect refinement, not nostalgia. Ryan tried to defend me, half-heartedly. Mom, maybe Elena's touch could add something new. Ryan, she interrupted sharply, your wife's cooking is fine for casual meals. But for our charity event, presentation matters. Her words cut deeper than I expected. I stayed quiet, pretending I agreed. But deep down, I made a silent decision I would cook anyway. I would show them that love had a taste, too. The night of the rehearsal dinner, I prepared a small meal for the family, a trial run. The aroma filled the kitchen, rich and warm, and for a brief moment, I believed it might change something. Maybe they'd see me differently. Maybe they'd finally accept me. But as I served the dishes, Clara laughed out loud. Oh my God, is that breadcrumbs on the chicken? How adorable. Margaret didn't even hide her smirk. It's quaint, she said, poking at the food with her fork. Elena, this might work for a small-town cafe, not a more charity gala. I felt my throat tighten. Ryan stayed silent again. He looked at me, then at his mother, and said softly, maybe we should just order catering this time. That moment, that single sentence, broke something inside me. I excused myself and went to the kitchen, my vision blurring with tears. My reflection in the glass cabinet looked like a stranger, small, tired, invisible. I had done everything right, and still, I was the family's punchline. As I wiped my tears, I heard voices drifting in from the dining room. Margaret's, sharp as ever, let her cook for the dinner. It'll be entertaining. People will talk. At least we'll give them something to laugh about. Clara giggled. A charity event with a charity cook. I stood there frozen, my hands trembling around the plate. They didn't just want me to fail, they wanted to humiliate me publicly. And in that moment, something inside me changed. The pain turned quiet, almost calm. I whispered to myself, fine. I'll cook. But this time, they'll choke on their laughter. That was the night humiliation turned into resolve. And without knowing it, the Morse had just served the first course of their own downfall. After that night, I stopped expecting kindness from the Morse. Every meal, every glance, every conversation felt like a test I was meant to fail. The charity dinner drew closer, and with each passing day, the house turned colder. Margaret's tone grew sharper, her orders more frequent. Elena, rewash these plates, the water spots show carelessness. Elena, next time, wear something more polished when the caterers visit. Her words weren't commands anymore, they were jabs meant to remind me of my place. Ryan tried to stay neutral, which somehow made it worse. He'd place a hand on my shoulder and say, just let it go, Elena. You know how she is. But every time he said that, I heard something else, you'll never be enough to change her mind. The small humiliations started piling up. At Clara's birthday brunch, I spent hours setting up the table, arranging the flowers, polishing the silver. When the guests arrived, Margaret introduced everyone by their accomplishments. My daughter, Clara, fresh from her fashion show in New York, and my son, Ryan, who just closed a major business deal. Then her eyes landed on me. A pause. A small smile. And this is Elena, she's very good at homemaking. Laughter filled the room, polite, but cutting. I smiled too, because that's what I was supposed to do. Inside, my stomach burned. Later that evening, I overheard one of the guests whisper, she seems sweet, but a little plain for this family, don't you think? And Margaret's soft chuckle followed, yes, but we all need a little humility in the house. I excused myself to the kitchen and stood there in silence, gripping the counter until my knuckles turned white. Humility, that's what they called humiliation here. But it was the next weekend that broke me. Margaret decided to host a small pre-dinner tasting for her close friends, women from her social club who adored her perfection. I wasn't told about it until the morning of. You'll cook something simple, dear, she said with mock sweetness. We wouldn't want to overwhelm our guests with your creativity. I spent the afternoon in the kitchen, my hands moving mechanically, my heart heavy. I made the same dish again, the one they had mocked before, rosemary chicken with my mother's sauce. It wasn't just food, it was a memory of love, something real in a house full of pretenses. When I served it, I stood back, watching. The women took small bites, then exchanged amused glances. "Oh, Margaret," one of them laughed, "this reminds me of something I had years ago in your old home, when you used to have that wonderful cook. What was her name?" Margaret froze for a split second, then forced a laugh. "Oh, Nora, yes, poor thing, she left long ago." That name. Nora. It echoed in my mind. My mother used to talk about a woman named Nora, her closest friend. A coincidence, maybe. But something about the way Margaret reacted, it didn't feel like coincidence at all. Later, as I cleaned up, Aunt Lillian approached me quietly. "You did well, Elena," she said softly, then hesitated. "Don't let them break you. You remind me of someone." Her eyes glistened for a moment before she turned away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Nora, about my mother, and about the strange tension that seemed to tighten whenever her name came up. Then, while clearing the pantry the next morning, I found something, an old, dust-covered cookbook tucked behind a stack of trays. On the first page, written in fading ink, was a familiar name. Nora Bennett, head chef, More Residence. My hands trembled as I traced the signature. The same recipes I'd been mocked for were hers. And at that moment, I realized the secret that could destroy their perfect image was hiding right in their own kitchen. Something big was coming. And this time, I wouldn't stay silent. The day everything fell apart started like any other, quiet, polite, suffocating. The Moore house gleamed under the morning sun, every corner spotless, every smile rehearsed. But beneath that perfection, something was about to break. After finding Nora's old recipe book, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The handwriting, the notes, the exact measurements, it was the same as my mother's. My mother, who used to whisper stories about her dearest friend Nora, the woman who taught her how to cook with love instead of pride. And now, I realized, Nora had once worked here in this very kitchen before she vanished from their family's history. I needed answers. That afternoon, I gathered the courage to ask Margaret about it. She was seated in the sunroom, sipping her tea, flipping through a lifestyle magazine as if her life were a photo shoot. "Margaret," I said, trying to sound casual, "I found an old cookbook in the pantry. It had Nora Bennett's name in it. Did she work here?" The teacup froze halfway to her lips. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she smiled too quickly, too perfectly. "Ah, yes. Nora. She was a cook we had decades ago. Why do you ask?" "She used to be my mother's friend," I replied softly. "I just didn't realize she worked for your family." The smile faltered. "Oh, really? How interesting." Then her tone shifted, low and sharp. "Be careful, Elena. Some people from the past bring nothing but trouble. You wouldn't want to dig up old stories that no one asked to remember." I understood the threat beneath the politeness. But it was too late, curiosity had already become suspicion. That night, I brought the cookbook to Aunt Lillian. When she saw it, her face went pale. "You found this," she whispered. "Oh, Elena." Margaret never forgave Nora. She accused her of stealing recipes and fired her in disgrace. But it wasn't true. Those recipes were Nora's, all of them. Margaret built her reputation on them. She even published a cookbook later, claimed it as her own. My chest tightened. So, everything she mocked me for was hers to be ashamed of, Lillian finished. Her voice trembled. "If Margaret finds out you know this, she'll destroy you, too." I didn't realize how true those words were until the night of the charity dinner. I had worked for days, preparing every dish with care. I wanted the food to speak for itself, real, honest, humble flavors. But before the event began, Margaret came into the kitchen, dressed in her glittering gown, a queen inspecting her servant. "Elena," she said smoothly, "you won't be needed tonight." I looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Her smile was sharp enough to cut. "I've decided to have it catered. We can't risk embarrassment. Don't take it personally." Behind her, Clara snickered. "Besides, dear, We want people to stay past the appetizers this year. I felt the air leave my lungs. Days of work, hours of effort, erased with a single sentence. I stood there, in my apron, surrounded by the food I made, while servants carried it out to be thrown away. Ryan entered moments later, avoiding my eyes. "It's just better this way," he muttered. "Better?" I whispered. "Better for who?" "For everyone," he said. "Please, Elena. Don't make a scene." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw every plate, every dish, every memory at their perfect marble walls. But I didn't. I just nodded, holding back tears that burned like acid. When the guests arrived, I watched from the hallway as Margaret accepted praise after praise for her signature menu. She had replaced my food with catered imitations, expensive, bland, soulless. Every bite was a lie, and they devoured it with pride. A reporter from a local magazine was there, taking pictures, complimenting her on her culinary legacy. Legacy. That word felt poisonous. Later that night, when the guests had left and the laughter had faded, I found myself alone in the dark kitchen. The smell of my discarded dishes still lingered. Rosemary, garlic, lemon, scents of love turned into ghosts. I sat on the cold tile floor and let myself break. All the years of trying to earn respect, all the quiet humiliations, all the moments I swallowed my pain, it all came flooding out. I thought of my mother. Of Nora. Of every woman who had worked, served, and been silenced. They stole my dignity, just like they stole those recipes. But this time, I wasn't going to let them bury the truth. As the clock struck midnight, I opened Nora's cookbook once more, tracing her faded handwriting. My tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink, but I could still read the last line she had written. "Love is the only flavor they can never steal." That's when I knew what I had to do. They wanted to humiliate me in public. Fine. But when I was done, they'd learn the taste of their own shame. And this time, I wouldn't be serving dinner. I'd be serving justice. After midnight, when the house finally slept, I stopped feeling small. The pain that had crushed me softened into a cold, steady focus. I wiped my face, closed Nora's cookbook, and made a decision that felt both dangerous and inevitable. I would not ask for respect. I would force the truth into the light. First, I gathered allies, the quiet ones who had nothing to gain but everything to lose. Aunt Lillian was the first. She met me in the garden, hands trembling, eyes full of things she'd never said aloud. "Margaret built herself on borrowed hands," she whispered. "I've been ashamed for years." Her confession came with something else, a box of old letters and a faded photograph of Nora in the Moore kitchen, smiling while Margaret took the credit. "I saved these," Lillian said. "I never believed she'd stoop this low, but if you're going to expose her, I'll stand with you." I felt a fierce gratitude and a new edge of courage. Next, I found Nora. She was smaller than I imagined, but when she spoke, her voice carried steel. "They shut me out and took my name," she said. "But names can be found again." Nora gave me oral histories, the exact timeline when recipes were taken, the names of people who could testify, the gossip that had been hushed away. She pressed into my hands a list, old menus, dates, and the year Margaret published her now famous cookbook. Then there was Chef Daniel, the only professional who still respected memory over PR. I visited his tiny restaurant with the cookbook tucked under my arm. He flipped through Nora's pages, eyes widening at the annotations and the unmistakable notes that matched the Moore family's signature dishes. "These aren't family lore," he said, stunned. "They're authored recipes. I'll help." His help came with risks. He would publicly reproduce the dishes and speak to food writers who cared about provenance. He warned me, if we do this, they'll try to shut us down. They'll use money, influence, everything. I needed proof that Margaret couldn't deny more than a dusty cookbook and whispering witnesses. Aunt Lillian's box contained a brittle draft of Margaret's early manuscript with Nora's handwriting in the margins. I took photos, copied pages, and recorded Nora's account on my phone. I found old invoices, receipts showing Nora's employment, tucked into an estate file hidden in the attic of the Moore house. Each piece felt like a match in a room that had been waiting to be lit. My plan had several parts, each risky and precise. First, Chef Daniel would prepare Nora's menu and invite a respected food critic and a local food blogger to the small pop-up dinner. We'd make it impossible to ignore. Taste alone would force a conversation. Second, Aunt Lillian would deliver a sealed letter to the editor of the town magazine, a confession and the scanned manuscript pages. Third, I would ensure that the charity dinner's press release went to the same people, with an anonymous heads-up: compare tonight's menu to a documented source. Most dangerous of all, I would confront them at their own stage. Even if Margaret had catered the event and taken my food away, the comparison would be public: the critic's write-up, the photos, the manuscripts, all pointing to one truth: the recipes were stolen. They could try to sue, to intimidate, to ruin my allies' livelihoods. They could humiliate me further. I lay out the plan to Nora, Daniel, and Lillian in whispers and folded papers. If we do this, Nora said, we don't just show they lied. We take back the work of a woman they buried. Chef Daniel held my gaze. This will get ugly, he warned. But it will stick. I felt the old ache in my chest, but it was different now, a steady drumbeat, not a wound. My hands didn't shake when I folded the final copies of evidence into envelopes. I had become someone who could hold fire without burning. The night of the charity dinner still loomed like a cliff. I closed the door on the kitchen and waited in the dark, listening to the house breathe. Would I go through with it? There was no turning back now. The charity gala was Margaret Moore's crown jewel, her night of glory. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers, the air thick with perfume, praise, and pretense. Every guest who mattered in our town was there. The tables gleamed with silver, the wine flowed, and Margaret, in her midnight blue gown, glided from one conversation to another, accepting compliments like offerings to a queen. I watched from the corner, calm and unreadable, my expression as polished as the glass in my hand. Only I knew what was about to happen. The catering team rolled out the first course, Margaret's signature rosemary chicken, the very recipe she'd once mocked me for serving. The guests clapped lightly as the servers moved between tables. The scent filled the room, rich, familiar, nostalgic. From across the room, I saw Chef Daniel enter, dressed in black, quiet but commanding. He wasn't part of the staff, he was an invited guest, one of the culinary consultants. Margaret noticed him immediately and smiled with her usual charm. "Chef Daniel, how wonderful to see you here. I've heard so much about your work." He nodded politely. "And I, Mrs. Moore, have heard plenty about yours." The band's music faded as conversation died down. All eyes shifted toward the front as the host, the magazine editor, took the stage. "Before we begin tonight's program," he announced, "we'd like to honor the Moore family's contribution to local culture, particularly Mrs. Margaret Moore's culinary legacy, which inspired generations." The applause was thunderous. Margaret beamed, placing a proud hand on Ryan's arm. My heart pounded, but I didn't move. "Not yet." Then the host continued, "Interestingly, tonight's menu features dishes recently discussed in a feature by Chef Daniel, part of a series on forgotten women in culinary history." A ripple moved through the crowd. Margaret's smile flickered. Chef Daniel stepped forward. "Yes," he said clearly, "these recipes come from an unpublished 1980s collection by a woman named Nora Bennett. A brilliant cook, uncredited, unrecognized, who worked for a prominent family before being dismissed under false accusations of theft." The room went still. My hands tightened around my clutch, my pulse loud in my ears. Daniel's gaze drifted across the crowd and landed on Margaret. "Some of you might recognize the dishes," he said, his voice steady. "They became quite famous under someone else's name." A whisper spread like wildfire. Faces turned. Margaret's expression froze, pride hardening into disbelief. "This is absurd," she snapped, forcing a laugh. "Surely, this isn't the time for gossip." Then I stepped forward. "It's not gossip," I said softly. My voice trembled not from fear, but from release. "It's truth." Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Ryan's widened. "Elena, what are you doing?" I walked closer, calm and deliberate, holding up Nora's worn cookbook. "This was found in your home, Margaret. Every recipe you built your name on, every flavor you called your heritage, came from Nora Bennett. The woman you destroyed. The same recipes you laughed at me for cooking. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. Aunt Lillian stepped from her table, tears glistening. She's telling the truth. I saw it all. You fired Nora and took everything she created. You built your fame on her work. Gasps echoed around the hall. Cameras clicked, the press snapping the moment like vultures circling gold. Stop this madness. Margaret hissed, voice cracking. You're humiliating this family. No, I said quietly, meeting her eyes. You did that the day you forgot what respect means. Chef Daniel held up the evidence, photographs of the manuscript pages, letters, the proof. These were verified this afternoon, he said firmly. There's no mistake. Ryan looked between us, pale. Mother, tell me this isn't true. Margaret's silence was the loudest sound in the room. The host tried to recover, stammering something about honoring truth, but it was too late. The Morse perfect facade shattered right there, under the golden lights of their own celebration. Guests whispered, phones buzzed, and Margaret's composure finally cracked. Her voice broke into a trembling whisper. You don't understand, everything I built. I cut her off gently. You built it on someone else's pain. Now it's time everyone knows. The music had stopped. Only silence filled the hall, a silence heavier than shame. Margaret lowered her head, trembling, her crown of perfection slipping at last. Ryan looked at me, speechless, torn between guilt and awe. I turned toward the crowd, my voice steady. Tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Respect can't be stolen, it can only be earned. Then I walked away, leaving the cookbook open on the table, Nora's name shining under the chandeliers where lies once glittered. The Morse had built their legacy on stolen recipes. And that night, the world finally tasted the truth. After the charity gala, silence hung over the Moore mansion like smoke after a fire, thick, choking, inescapable. No one said a word as the guests drifted out, leaving behind half-finished plates and the faint, bitter scent of scandal. The next morning, the newspapers did what I didn't have to. Front pages and blogs carried the story: Margaret Moore's cookbook scandal, recipes stolen from former employee. The photos were merciless, Margaret frozen mid-expression, her face pale and stunned, me standing beside her holding Nora's cookbook like evidence of truth. Ryan didn't come home that night. He stayed with friends, too ashamed or too confused to face me. Philip locked himself in his study. Clara deleted her social media accounts, her usual confidence replaced by silence. And Margaret, she didn't come down for breakfast. When I finally saw her 2 days later, she sat in the same sunroom where she used to give orders. The room looked smaller now, as if her pride had been holding the walls apart all these years. She didn't speak when I entered. Just stared out the window. Finally, she said, her voice brittle, "You've ruined us." I stood there for a long moment, then answered softly, "No, Margaret. I just stopped pretending." She turned her head, eyes red. "Do you think this makes you better than me?" I shook my head. "No. It just means I finally chose myself." There was nothing left to say. I left the house quietly, carrying only a suitcase and Nora's cookbook. I didn't slam the door, I didn't need to. The echo of truth was loud enough to follow me out. Aunt Lillian hugged me at the gate. "You did what none of us had the courage to do," she whispered. "You reminded them that respect isn't inherited, it's earned." I smiled through tears. And it's never too late to earn it back. Over the next few weeks, the Moore name faded from the society pages. Their parties were cancelled, their invitations declined. Margaret's cookbook was pulled from shelves, her sponsors withdrew, and her reputation, once polished to perfection, now carried the stain of exposed deceit. Nora's story, however, took on new life. Chef Daniel's article spread online, celebrating her as the true creator of those recipes. For the first time in decades, her name was spoken with admiration instead of rumor. I watched from afar, quietly proud. As for me, I started my own small cooking workshop, The Honest Table. I taught others not just how to cook, but how to serve food with heart and humility. People came not because of my last name, but because of my truth. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about Ryan. About how silence had cost him everything. Maybe one day he'd understand what it means to stand beside truth instead of comfort. But that's no longer my battle. One evening, while locking up the kitchen, I found an envelope taped to the door. Inside was a single note, written in shaky handwriting. You were right. Respect cannot be borrowed. M. I didn't cry. I just smiled, because even in defeat, she had finally spoken something real. As I turned off the lights, I whispered the lesson that had taken me years to learn. Dignity isn't given by others. It's what you reclaim when they try to take it away. The Morse lost their image. Nora regained her name. And I, the woman they once laughed at, walked away with peace, not power. Because revenge wasn't the meal I served. Truth was. And it was enough.